Good morning, everyone. I'm Frank Carino. I'm Chief Legal Counsel for Westfield, and we are lucky to be joined today by Nick Rasmussen. Nick is joining us as part of our Facebook Live leadership series for the Cleveland Leadership Center, and I understand, Nick, you just spoke to a Leadership Cleveland class just now.
Yes, it was a terrific opportunity.
And we really appreciate you taking some of the time to impart your wisdom and your experiences in terms of leadership and maybe some tips for the group watching this particular episode of the series. A little bit about your background. It's very admirable history. We know that you've served in the U.S. intelligence community since 2001, and prior to that, you were at the State Department for 10-15 years, and you've had a number of senior posts in several administrations with the White House, and all involved national security.
That's right.
Up and down the line.
Right.
And today, in fact, I guess in June of 2018, you joined the McCain Institute?
I did. I stepped down from government service at the very end of 2017, and then I took a position with the McCain Institute for International Leadership in June of last year, 2018.
Yeah, my understanding it's an outcropping of Arizona State. But
it's attached to Arizona State University, but it's an organization located in Washington, D.C. that focuses on advancing Senator McCain's legacy and example of character-driven leadership around the world.
I found it very interesting that it characterizes itself as a do tank, excuse me,
exactly,
as opposed to a think tank.
That's correct. What that means is that we're out. The objective is not to write reports telling other people how to solve problems. The objective is to get out in the world and actually help solve problems ourselves.
Sort of in keeping with his memory. I know he passed away just a couple months after you joined.
Yes. And the focus is on advancing in a bipartisan way that legacy.
That's great to hear, and he's being held in high regard these days, which is only proper. We'll throw a few questions out to you here, so you can and feel free to elaborate as much as you like on this. We have you down here as joining the Office of Combating Terrorism as the Director of Regional Affairs. That's a mouthful. Just 6 days after the 9/11 attack. That's literally, I would say, almost an operational definition of trial by fire.
Yes.
We here presume that you probably learned a lot of different skills just in that experience for leadership purposes.
Well, it was very much, for those who are old enough to remember, it was very much a period of national crisis here in the United States. And so joining the White House, the National Security Council staff at the White House at that time, it was an 18-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week job environment, and in a way, trial by fire is exactly the way to think about it. It was the decisions that we were making. One of the things that's lost now, I think, in our historical memory is just how much we were worried after 9/11 that there could be another 9/11.
Yes.
And literally every day we were reading intelligence reports that told us that Al-Qaeda or other terrorists might try to again carry out large-scale attacks on the homeland. And so that put a tremendous amount of pressure on our leaders at every level, and certainly on those of us. I was more junior at the time, but we all felt that pressure very, very acutely.
Was there a group that you worked with that you said to yourself, that's how this should be done? Because I think a lot of it was probably invention. It wasn't like you had a template for this.
No, you're right. There wasn't really a template for how to respond in the aftermath of something like that, and we were also, as a government, in the early stages of having to reorganize to deal with the failings that were exposed as a result of the 9/11 attack. So here you are in a crisis atmosphere trying to crisis manage, which is always a challenge all by itself, and at the same time, people are stepping back, those around you are stepping back and saying, wait a minute, we may need to reorganize this whole enterprise. You remember, we didn't have a Department of Homeland Security prior to 9/11.
Yeah, part of the invention.
Exactly. We did not have a Director of National Intelligence. We did not have a National Counterterrorism Center, the organization I led when I left government. All of these significant organizational changes came out of 9/11, and imagine trying to pursue those large organizational changes at the same time everybody's working with a hair on fire mentality, trying to keep people safe from another terrorist attack.
It's very daunting. I presume none of you were pulling books off the shelf, Leadership 101 or whatever the flavor of the day for leadership books were. You pretty much had to do it.
Well, and in my experience, I've learned when I was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, I used to speak to various leadership development programs and events inside my own workforce. And I always felt a little bit bashful about doing that because over the course of my career, I didn't have much, if any, formal leadership training. Most of the leadership training, if you want to even call it training, for me, came by watching and observing and identifying role models. And I always found that those role models could come in both positive and negative forms. I remember at times being in a meeting or a conversation where I would look at someone who was a senior official or a senior leader and saying, wow, if I ever am given the opportunity to be in a leadership position, I'm going to do it the way she did or he did. On the other hand, I also saw people all the time where I'd say, wow, I hope I don't behave like that.
That's just as important, really.
I felt, I agree with you 100%.
Maybe
even more so, because even some people I admired tremendously, I sometimes looked at the way they did business and said to myself, ooh, I think that's actually costing them. They're less successful than they should be at meeting their goals because they're operating in a certain way.
Those of us, from the outside looking in, always presume there's always a bureaucratic morass, in government. And given the urgency of what occurred, how did you break through those barriers to get through things?
Well, I always look a little bit differently at there's the government and the bureaucratic morass you're referring to, and I think you're not wrong about that. But in the national security side or the national security world, I think there are more efficient ways of doing business and certainly more efficient ways of making decisions about important problems. Each president has a National Security Council staff that is responsible for organizing decision making for him. And that does a great job, in most cases, of bringing the right information to the table, bringing the right stakeholders to the table. You often hear about the situation room.
Sure.
Well, I must have attended maybe a couple of thousand meetings in the White House Situation Room during the period since 9/11. And in most of those meetings, what you've got around the table are representatives from all of the big government organizations, the State Department, the Defense Department, the Justice Department, the Central Intelligence Agency. Yeah. And that brings the right expertise, the right knowledge around the table, guided by the president, guided by his senior staff. And that's the way it should work. It doesn't always work that way, but it does work.
Can we talk about that table for a moment, the proverbial sitting around the table?
Sure.
All these different folks come in here, and I presume there's some sort of primacy among them. So here you are, you're trying to advise them, or you're trying to learn, whatever it is. How deferential do you have to be, and at the same time, how do you get a really important opinion across?
That's a good question, because obviously each of these government organizations is hierarchical. You have people in very senior positions.
Much like a lot of private businesses.
And then and you have people who are in more junior positions. And this is, I think, part of being a good leader is understanding where does expertise reside. And so if you're a good leader, it's just as important to know what you don't know as what you do know. And so one of the things I admired, for example, about President Obama, among the many things I admired about President Obama after serving at the Obama White House, there were times in meetings around the Situation Room table where he had his cabinet level principals, Secretary Clinton, Secretary Gates, or Secretary Carter from the Defense Department. But at the end, or at points in the meeting, the president would still on occasion say, anybody in the back row have something to say that hasn't been said? And of course, that's an opportunity to tap into expertise of a more junior person who may be just a backbencher in the meeting. But the president was wise enough to know that that's actually where good ideas might be found, where expertise could be found, and that sometimes you don't want that person feeling constrained from speaking up just because of some hierarchical relationship.
Yeah, and if you flip it on its head, I mean, most people in government, especially at the political level, have to defer to experts. When do they have to finally just make a decision? Okay, I've heard enough from all these different experts. A lot of static here, a lot of things I like here. How do you make the decision?
That's more art than science.
Yeah.
I would say, but I've certainly seen that with presidents I've worked for, and in some cases, it's a case of simply needing to turn off the flow of information, because actually more information is not illuminating any better solutions. The trade-offs we face are just as bad as they are, even if we have more information. And I think of some of the very difficult national security problems I've been involved with, Afghanistan, what to do in Syria, dealing with Iran, issues like that. Yes, you want the very best information, but at some point a president or any leader has to decide, okay, what does my best judgment tell me is the course of action that best protects American national security? And reading another intelligence report isn't going to give him that answer.
Yeah, and oftentimes you're probably faced with the paradox of abundance. There's so much there,
Yes.
you can't do anything.
Yes. And actually sometimes
How do you pick your
that
spots?
information can almost lead to paralysis. And if you've got too much information or you're worried that if we just get a little more information, the decision will be easier, it can lead to paralysis.
Yeah, so this is a tool I think that, you know, if you could impart upon this audience, how you solve for that. I think that's one of the top things that people run into in leadership.
Well, you know, I guess
environments.
to me, when I'm asked what are great leadership qualities, for me the greatest leadership quality of all is always self-awareness.
Yeah, same one.
Because self-awareness, if you have it, allows you to know what you don't know.
Yes.
So where and when do you need to turn for additional expertise or additional information? It also allows you to compensate for your own weaknesses. If you're good at something, you want to surround yourself with people who have complementary skill sets, who may be more analytical than you are, or maybe more better at explaining difficult concepts. But you can't choose those people to work around you that complement your skill set unless you're self-aware about your own strengths and weaknesses. And to me, that's, you know, people don't rise to leadership positions without having some degree of ego and self-esteem.
Sure.
You know, it's part of the package.
That's how you got to the table.
It's how you got to the table, but you're going to be successful at the table, in my view, if you have an equal amount of self-awareness about your shortcomings or where you might need support or help from others.
Yeah, I think you really touched on one of the other tenets that the Leadership Center in Cleveland always ascribes to, which of course is collaborative leadership. And presumably now that you're at the Institute, are you carrying that forward with your clients and with your
very much so. I
projects?
mean, one of the my program at the McCain Institute is just getting off the ground, but one of the things we're going to be doing is working with communities around the country on the problem of violent extremism and terrorism here in the homeland. And it's not that we from Washington or we from the McCain Institute will bring answers that will solve the problem, but what we can do is bring a lot of knowledge, a lot of insight, and then work with communities to figure out what tools they have. Because in many cases, terrorism now is not a problem of just groups overseas like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. Terrorism is also a problem now of individuals here in our own communities in the United States who radicalize on their own.
Yes.
And decide to carry out, you know, a horrific act. So that means that not every one of these cases is going to be solved by the FBI or the CIA or something like that. It's often going to be communities that are the first line responders for something like this.
You know, as you're doing your work to roll this out, when you say community, are you talking about going to governmental agencies within like cities or groups?
Both. Actually, both.
Okay.
Both non-governmental organizations, community organizations that are led by members of the community outside of formal government structures, but also working with municipal authorities, state-level authorities to help them develop a toolkit or a toolbox that will allow them as a government or as a municipal authority to participate in the effort to to promote public safety by keeping communities safe. But it also involves communities and community organizations that are also out there, and they can often be more effective than government because they don't carry the taint of being the government.
Yes, and you know, they probably have constituencies out there that we can't even imagine that they could influence.
Exactly, and so I think, you know, we often talk, when I was in the government, we would often talk about our approach to a terrorism problem as being a whole of government approach. That's only part of it. We actually need it to be a whole of society approach, and so that's some of what I'm trying to do from the McCain Institute.
Yeah, I find it interesting when you're talking about what's going on, you know, in country, so to speak. And one of the interesting things that has come about is we've almost, as a society, become numb to some of these occurrences.
I think that's right,
And
you don't want that to be the case.
Yeah, and you need leaders out there to try to rally people to be vigilant, to be, you know, ready.
And yet at the same time, you don't want to be fear-mongering either. You don't want people to be...
How do you strike that balance?
Well, you know, the way I think about it is what you want is communities to take responsibility for their own safety and security. So it's kind of it's not too different from a community policing approach that I think many police departments use in dealing with violent crime. You make the community a partner in the conversation so that you're not only going to the community at the moment when there's some big threat, and that you leave people scared or frightened by what you, the government, is telling them could happen. But instead, you go to them at a time when you don't have that threat situation, but you're actually talking to them all the time, and they become part of the conversation about resilience, community resilience, keeping the community safe, and not only safe, but able to bounce back if there is a violent incident.
Yes.
And not have those incidents necessarily throw us into chaos or cause us to overreact either. So a word we often use in the work I'm involved in is prevention and resilience. You want to be able to work with communities to prevent these incidents from happening, and the way to do that is to involve the community, but you also want to kind of work with the community to develop resilience so that you can respond effectively when these incidents do happen.
Yeah, and so when you're interacting with these community leaders, I mean, they're not trained for this at all. A lot of them aren't. You're going to walk in a room, and
right.
There's no home skill set. So how do you get
Well,
that
that's some of what I was doing when I was still in government. We would conduct exercises. We would conduct kind of, in a sense, practice sessions. We would call them tabletops, war game type exercises, where you would walk through a scenario with community leaders and say, okay, if this were to happen in your community, how would you respond? What resources would you have to draw upon? Emergency management, police and fire, medical emergency. What do you have at your disposal? How would you bring those tools into play? In a sense, don't wait until game day to try to figure this out. Right? In a crisis, when everybody's stressed and under pressure, think these issues through now in a calmer setting when you can actually pretend that such an incident is happening, and you can kind of, that both gives you a skill set you didn't have before in terms of how to manage these crises. It also helps you identify gaps in your own preparedness. Oh wow, we would have really screwed that up if this was a real situation. We better make sure we cover down on that gap.
And given who the community leaders are, sometimes they fall out of offices too. So
well, they turn over, and so it's a
right.
constant effort to try to involve community leaders in this public safety work.
Yeah, very admirable work, and again, in keeping with the mission of the Institute.
Very much so.
Very impressive. Any other tidbits you'd like to share with the group here? You've been through a lot, and very rare occurrences.
I guess when I think about leadership, one of the other responsibilities I think good leaders have is to be a mentor to other younger people. One of the things as I left government that worried me the most was, in these difficult political times, will young people still go into public service
yes.
in the way that they should? You want the best and brightest, serving in Washington or serving in government in a city or a state or any organization. And what you don't want is to have people self-selecting out of that process just because the politics of our time seem crazy.
Yes.
So I took it as a very serious obligation when I was still in government to try to identify talented young people and make sure that they were headed in the right direction and pursuing a path that was going to lead to a leadership position someday. So I would, whether you're in a company or a government organization or any kind of organization, I think you pay it forward by working to identify the next generation of leaders. And I guess I would leave it there.
I think we'll do the same for this discussion. And Nick, thanks very much.
I enjoyed it.
For sitting this interview.
I really appreciate it.
Look forward to meeting you in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.